Akash Chougule is president of the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity. Now, your foundation, Akash, studies opportunity and equality from your perspective. What's driving, from your research, the sharp rise in social isolation and mental health struggles, especially among young men?
Yeah, thank you very
Welcome to
much.
the broadcast, by the way.
Thank you very much for having me, Armstrong. And I'm grateful that you're even talking about this important subject. I don't think you can pinpoint any one cause. I think there are economic problems, there are cultural problems, there are social problems. And we too often only look at one of those three buckets of issues when we look at the policy landscape and sort of what elite leaders and policymakers can do. But it really is all of the above. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to address this issue on Monday at the National Symposium for Young Men. We need to restore economic opportunity, upward mobility, but also civic participation, friendships. We need to get people off the internet back to in-person interactions with one another. And I think that's really how we can strengthen society for young men and make them feel like this country really can offer them everything that a healthy, vibrant life should have.
Let's go a little deeper in the dependency on social media and the fact that men cannot bond as easily as women, who can be affectionate and tender and caring and open with each other. And the fact that some of them are not growing up with men who reinforces what it means to be a man, and all the things that goes with sacrifice and discipline and real self-esteem and real work ethic. Talk about how all these things intertwine, impacting this.
Absolutely critical. I would encourage your viewers to look up something called a success sequence, which basically states that if you do these three things in order, Armstrong, if you graduate from high school, get a job, and get married before having kids, if you do those three things in order, your odds of being in poverty are less than 2%. You are almost guaranteed to enter into the middle class. Obviously, by then, you've built a vibrant, wholesome life. But young men who lack strong male role models in their lives, it's going to be more difficult for them to make the right decisions that they need to make. Of course, understanding that they're already often coming from challenging circumstances. And so lacking male role models in their real lives, where do they go for community and for guidance and for role models? Too often, unfortunately, that becomes the internet, and it becomes this hostile, impersonal environment that frankly is just not healthy for people. And so I'm, again, grateful that we're having these conversations because frankly, Armstrong, a lot of the conversations have been around other groups in this country for several years, which is great. And these are well-intended conversations. But I think now it's time to focus on this group of Americans.
You know, I'll tell you, I've never shared this story before, Akash. It's so crazy. When I'm out all across the country, I have so many young men and their fathers say they watch this show because about manhood, about being tough, about work ethic, about sacrifice. And now their mothers and their sisters don't always like it because they think it's a chauvinistic show that caters to men. Of course, that's not true. I don't have a chauvinistic bone in my body. But young men are in search of role models. It is so true. And I'm just curious about how does declining college enrollment and falling workforce participation connect to this broader sense of disconnection and loss of purpose. These kids want to have purpose, but they can't seem to find it. And then what happens, they get so lost in drugs like alcohol, marijuana, and it just further isolates them from reality.
Yeah, and look, I don't want to say that young men are without agency of their own. Every individual is responsible for their own decision making. And that is absolutely true with young men as it is with any group. But Armstrong, you have to look at certain major institutions in our society. It is without question that they have become more hostile to young men. They've become hostile to masculinity and sort of this traditional, idea of what a man should be, not being a chauvinist, but being a strong character who can lead their family, lead their community, lead their place of work, and so on. I think that's something we have to recognize and address. And then I think the other thing is, this decline in civic participation, right? Church attendance is down. Participation in friend groups is down. I think, men can find role models in their fathers and their uncles, in teachers and coaches. And there's, a number of places where that can be the case. I think college is one of these places that has become more hostile for young men. But college isn't the only pathway to upward mobility, right? You don't have to go to college to build a strong, stable life for yourself and be a contributing member of your society. society. And I think these are all parts of the same conversation that we need
Well,
to be
let
having
me ask you this,
about
because
what
you
it means.
keep alluding to it, and I'm going to go there. I'm going to go directly to it. Why do you think it seems that there's an undercurrent to try to feminize these boys?
I don't know that it's an undercurrent to feminize them, Armstrong. I think originally it was well-intentioned to make these environments, more comfortable for women to enter and succeed into. And I think that's absolutely critical, and has been since the civil rights era, getting women into college and into the workplace and so on. And I think that's all phenomenal, but it's sort of gone, now the case is more women are going to college. Women are doing better in school, and that's great. But now we need to help men catch up to them as well. And I want to add one other critical point. That does not mean that what men need is their own version of affirmative action, their own version of DEI or some other kind of handout or carve out. No, what we need is a society of truly equal opportunity, of strong culture, of strong values. And I think that would honestly successfully facilitate the rise of young men into the vibrant contributing members of society and their families and their communities that we know that they can be.
What role can faith groups, churches, fraternities, community organizations play in rebuilding positive male spaces and mentorship networks? And I also want you to talk about the symposium and your emphasis on education to employment pathways and skilled trades, and how we can expand that access to these opportunities for young men who don't take the traditional college route.
Yeah, let me answer your first question. Faith groups are absolutely critical, as are any civic society. But I think faith in particular is absolutely vital to having meaning in life and having something bigger than yourself that you believe in. And church attendance is down. We know that church attendance is down. We know that as a related result, loneliness is up. Young American men are among the loneliest groups in the entire world. When you look at OECD data, that should be a national crisis. And I think these civic society groups and churches and things like that, they not only provide male role models, Armstrong, but they also help young men become role models, right? For younger boys, younger kids, mentoring, coaching, all these other things, that add meaning to the life of a young man. Churches and civic society plays a critical role that, government and these other kind of out of touch institutions will simply never be able to replicate. Now, when it comes to career pathways and things like that, again, those pathways are available, but I think we need to end the social stigma around them. And I think policymakers have begun to figure this out, right? The tax treatment of different education benefits, for example, right? A pretty weedy subject, but if you get a tax benefit or some kind of benefit to pay for college education, you should be able to use that for any kind of lifelong learning, trade school, anything like that. Because again, not only are these critical pathways to upward mobility for men who don't go to college, for anybody who doesn't go to college, but they're also a great way that we can fill jobs that we need to fill in this country that disproportionately can be filled by young men, right? Jobs where we work with our hands, quote unquote, blue collar jobs. Our policy environment needs to facilitate the ability of young men to enter into these fields, excel in them, and thereby, again, contribute to their communities and their country.
For my brothers and I, we grew up on a farm, and it was sort of like the military. I mean, early to bed, early to rise, discipline, an example of just working from sun up to sundown by the sweat of your brow. My father always said a man needs to get his hands dirty. How do we get men back to understanding what manhood is and what's expected of them, being the providers and the head of the household? And I don't mean that in a way that maligns women, but how do we get back to some of those traditions? Do we make it mandatory that they go to the military the first 2 years out of high school? What do we need to do? Something needs to change dramatically.
Yeah, I don't know that the answer is that government needs to require something of young men. I think our society just needs to have the right set of values, right? Our culture needs to understand that these are critical elements to the livelihoods of young men, and therefore that the health of young men directly relates to the health of families, of communities, and of our country as a whole. So I think there's no one right answer. It's not just the military or just sports or just fraternities. It's kind of an all of the above. And I really think it goes back to your discussion of role models, right? Are we helping set the environment that young men are incentivized to make the right decisions for themselves? And do they have role models around them in person, in their real lives, that they can access directly, that demonstrate to them what that success looks like? What a dignified.
How can someone in 30 seconds attend your symposium on Monday?
Yeah, absolutely. They can, just Google the Symposium on Young American Men. It's going to be in Washington, D.C. all day Monday. Going to be a phenomenal event, bipartisan group of lawmakers, sponsors from all across the ideological spectrum, and it really critical start to a conversation that I hope continues for many months and years.
Man, I truly wish you well. Thank you so much for what you do.